A billionaire's twin daughters hadn't slept through the night in years until a new black nanny arrived and did something no one expected. That woman is drugging the children. The accusation echoed through the grand marble foyer of the Whitmore estate like a gunshot. Mr. Richard, how can those kids who used to scream through the night suddenly sleep like angels? She's doing something illegal to them. Natasha Williams. 28 stood quietly in the center of the foyer facing Jessica, the 60-year-old housekeeper who was flailing her arms dramatically in front of the mansion's owner. Natasha wasn't surprised. In fact, she had anticipated this moment from the very first week, the moment she accepted the job of caring for the 4-year-old twin girls who had driven 6 previous nannies to quit within 6 months. Richard Whitmore, real estate mogul and inconsolable widower, looked back and forth between his longtime housekeeper and the young nanny, who had somehow turned a house once filled with screams into a haven of peace. For the first time since his wife's death, his daughters Ruby and Rose were sleeping a full 8 hours a night. Jessica. That's a serious accusation, Richard said, clearly uneasy. Serious, Jessica shot back, her voice like venom. Mr. Richard, she came from some obscure suburb in Detroit with no proper references. And now your girls who used to have nightly meltdowns sleep like babies. Something is very wrong here. Natasha took a deep breath and glanced at Richard. In her eyes was more than gratitude for the newfound calm. There was a sincere question: why would a well-educated woman fluent in child psychology take a job most professionals ran from? If you'd like to investigate my methods, Natasha said calmly, her voice so composed it made Jessica hesitate. I'd suggest installing cameras in the girls' room. That way everyone can see exactly what happens at night. The room fell completely silent. Someone guilty would never invite more surveillance. Richard furrowed his brow, studying Natasha's steady face. She carried herself with quiet confidence, not like a typical nanny. Within days of her arrival, he'd noticed things: she spoke 3 languages, fluently referenced neuroscience studies on child development with scholarly precision, and even managed to earn the respect of high-profile guests during conversations. 3 weeks earlier, when the agency first sent her over, Richard had been desperate. 6 nannies gone. Ruby and Rose screaming, refusing to sleep, the entire household drained and exhausted. Jessica had made her position clear long ago: people like her shouldn't be raising children in respectable families. But the very first afternoon Natasha arrived, something shifted. The girls, usually terrified of strangers, had approached her with quiet curiosity. That night, something miraculous happened. They slept for 6 uninterrupted hours. Cameras, Jessica stammered. That won't be necessary if she just... Actually, Natasha cut in, pulling out her phone. I've already recorded some of the girls' nighttime routines. I track their progress. Would you like to see? The silence in the room deepened. Richard noticed Jessica's expression flicker from defiant to suddenly unsettled. In the very hall that once embodied the old power of the Whitmore legacy, Natasha stood unfazed, holding back a truth she wasn't ready to reveal, but knowing that day would come. Richard said nothing for a moment, his gaze drifting to the garden where his daughters now played laughing under the summer sun. For the first time in months, he saw them joyful. That laughter pierced straight through the ice that had gripped his heart since Amanda, his beloved wife, died in that tragic car accident. Jessica, Richard said gently, though there was clarity in his tone, perhaps you're overreacting. Look at them, they're happy, eating well, sleeping through the night, even going to school without panic. Exactly why I'm worried, Jessica snapped, her voice rising. She's manipulating them, and you can't see it because you're desperate. But I know her type. They act humble at first, perform a few miracles, then start asking for raises, gifts, access to your bank accounts. Natasha remained still. Her eyes didn't flinch. Jessica's outburst didn't shock her, she'd seen it all before. As a child, she'd watched her own mother, a housekeeper, be belittled by longtime staff in rich households, bullied and distrusted simply for being too smart, too calm, or too different. Jessica has no idea what's coming. Natasha thought. She was not an ordinary nanny. Natasha Williams held a master's degree in child psychology from the University of Michigan. She had worked as a pediatric trauma consultant at 3 major hospitals and even ran her own clinic back in Detroit. She hadn't taken this nanny job for the money. She had another reason, deeper, more personal. What disturbs me the most, Jessica pressed on, now nearly losing control, is how calm she is. A normal woman accused of drugging children would be freaking out. But look at her standing there like she knows something the rest of us don't. Richard frowned. As much as he hated to admit it, Jessica had a point. There was something about Natasha, a confidence that bordered on unsettling, as if she was always 3 steps ahead. Actually, Natasha said softly, her voice calm enough to chill the room, I do know something you don't. Silence fell like a hammer. Jessica froze as if she'd accidentally triggered something she wasn't ready to face. I know Ruby wakes up every night at exactly 2:30 a.m. because she dreams of falling, just like her mother did during the car crash, Natasha said, her eyes gently resting on Richard. I know Rose won't sleep unless she checks every door in the house, because deep down, this place stopped feeling safe the moment her mother left and never came back. Richard felt his breath catch. How could she know that? He had never told anyone the details, never said that Amanda had been thrown from the car, her body tumbling down a ravine. I also know, Natasha went on, turning her gaze now to Jessica, that you've told the other nannies in your network that this family needs someone of their own kind to care for the girls. The WhatsApp group chats of the elite nanny circle are quite revealing, aren't they? Jessica's face drained of color, then flushed bright red in a heartbeat. How do you... I didn't... But you did, Natasha said with a slight smile. You even said I was here to seduce a lonely old widower. That's a direct quote from your message last Thursday. Richard turned toward Jessica, his expression shifting from confusion to deep suspicion. Is that true? Jessica stammered, her composure slipping into full-blown panic. How did Natasha get access to private messages? How could she know everything? But Natasha stood still, her eyes unwavering. In fact, Jessica now recognized the look in her eyes. Not just calm, but calculated. Dangerous. This wasn't just a smart nanny. This was a woman who had come prepared for battle. The truth is, Natasha said, her voice gentle yet razor sharp, I didn't take this job because I needed money. I took it because your family needed more than just childcare. She turned to Richard. And Jessica, she's been blocking real progress in this house more than you realize. For the first time in 15 years, Richard saw something he'd never seen in Jessica's eyes: fear. And for the first time since Natasha arrived, he began to question whether she was just a brilliant nanny. The air in the room thickened like a storm cloud about to burst. Jessica tried to compose herself, but her face had turned ghostly pale. Richard, meanwhile, kept staring at Natasha, feeling 1,000 questions bubble to the surface. Then Natasha stepped toward the small table near the fireplace and picked up a dark leather folder. Jessica, she said, her tone firm, are you sure you want to keep accusing me? Because if I open this file, there's no turning back. Jessica's eyes widened in panic. Mr. Richard, she pleaded, she's threatening us. This is exactly the kind of manipulation I warned you about. But Richard wasn't listening anymore. He was completely absorbed by Natasha, the woman he once thought was simply an unusually qualified nanny, now revealing layers of strategy and secrets far beyond anything he'd imagined. She wasn't just composed, she was calculated. Not just capable, formidable. 3 weeks ago, when I took this job, Natasha began her hand resting on the leather file folder. It wasn't because I needed employment. It was because I received a very particular phone call from someone you know very well. She unlocked her phone and played a recording. A woman's voice, clear and professional, filled the room. Jessica, I need to tell you something. Natasha Williams is not an ordinary nanny. She holds a master's degree in child psychology, specializing in trauma. When I heard she took a position with the Whitmore twins, I was genuinely surprised. Someone of her caliber doesn't take jobs like that for the money. Richard froze. Natasha, you have a master's degree, University of Michigan? She nodded. I worked at Detroit Children's Hospital for 5 years before opening my own private clinic specializing in pediatric trauma therapy. Richard shook his head slowly, as if struggling to process the revelation. Then why would I accept a job that pays 1/10 of what I used to make? Natasha gave a small, bittersweet smile. Because this isn't about money, Mr. Whitmore. It's about justice. She then pulled out another folder. 6 months ago, you fired an engineer named Marcus Johnson for being culturally incompatible with Whitmore Enterprises. Do you remember that? Richard frowned. Marcus? Yes, I recall. There were some issues. The issue, Natasha said, her voice now like a blade of ice, was that Jessica advised your head of HR that my brother Marcus Johnson did not fit the image of the Whitmore brand. She placed a printed email on the table dated March 3rd with the names of 5 board members copied on it. Jessica could barely breathe now. "He's my brother," Natasha said, each word dropping like a stone. "And when he told me about the systemic discrimination he experienced under your roof, I decided to investigate myself." Richard collapsed back into the armchair, the wind completely knocked out of him. The woman who had saved his daughters was the sister of the man he'd wrongfully dismissed. Marcus lost his job 2 days before his wife gave birth to their 3rd child. Natasha continued, her voice sharper now, but composed. "He was unemployed for 4 months, nearly lost his home, and his wife suffered untreated postpartum depression because they had no insurance." I didn't know," Richard murmured, shaken. "Of course not. Jessica made sure you never would." Natasha turned to the housekeeper now. "Because people like you whisper in the shadows. You plant seeds of doubt in the ears of power. You make them believe people like my brother aren't the right fit, not traditional enough, not white enough." Jessica made one final attempt to defend herself. "She's here to destroy your family. This is a setup. She planned this all along." "Yes." Natasha nodded, her smile now razor sharp. "I planned all of it, but not to destroy anyone, to expose the truth." She held up her phone. "Every conversation in this house over the past 21 days has been recorded legally. I stated on day 1 that I would document and store data for professional purposes." She scrolled through the screen, revealing messages, audio files, even video clips. Every racist remark, every attempt at sabotage, every time you tried to wedge yourself between me and the children. Richard stood frozen. The woman he once believed to be the pillar of his household had been sowing poison, and the woman he thought was just an unusually smart nanny had become something else entirely. Natasha spoke soft but certain. "The children sleep well, not because they were drugged, but because finally someone understands the pain they carry, someone trained to listen, someone who knows what it's like to be grieving and unheard." Jessica stepped back. Her gaze darted nervously, her voice trembling. "Richard, you can't believe this. She's manipulating you." Richard raised a hand, quietly but firmly. He didn't want to hear another word from Jessica. A storm churned inside him, shame, anger, and a growing, hollow ache. He wondered now for how many years had he been blind, how many decisions had been shaped by whispers he mistook for wisdom. Natasha didn't look away, but this time her eyes weren't cold. They were understanding. "Mr. Whitmore," she said softly, "I didn't come here to make you feel guilty. I came here for the children. Because if no one dares to break this silence, they'll grow up in a house full of unspoken pain and never even know it was there." Richard let out a long sigh and slowly nodded. He turned to look at Jessica, the woman who had stood by him for so many years, now suddenly more unfamiliar than ever. "I need you to leave this house right now," he said, his voice low and heavy. "What?" Jessica gasped, nearly shouting. "Richard, you can't do this. I've been by your side for 16 years. I've cared for every meal, every holiday. I'm the only one left after everything." "Exactly," Richard replied, his eyes brimming with tears. "Which is why I trusted you completely. But today I finally see devotion isn't always love. Sometimes it's just control dressed up as loyalty." Jessica stood frozen. Natasha said nothing more. She let Richard finish what he had to. "You have 1 hour to gather your things and leave. I'll arrange a severance, but you are not to have contact with the girls again." Silence. Then, like a fading shadow, Jessica quietly left the room. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving a weighty stillness. Richard sank into the long bench, resting his forehead in his hand. Natasha stepped closer, gently, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I know you're not a bad man, but you've been surrounded by people who only ever told you what you wanted to hear, not what you needed to hear." Richard nodded faintly. "You're right. I stayed silent for too long because I was afraid of facing the mess." He looked up at Natasha. "You were the only one brave enough to look it in the eye, and though I didn't see it sooner, I truly am grateful that you're here." That evening, Ruby and Rose curled up in Natasha's lap on the living room sofa. A cartoon played on the screen, but their eyes seemed to be searching for something deeper. "Miss Natasha," Ruby whispered, Did you and Mrs. Jessica have a fight today? Natasha nodded, not hiding from the truth. Yes, sometimes grown-ups have to speak the truth even when it's hard. Rose squeezed her hand tightly. We don't want you to go anywhere. Natasha smiled and kissed each girl on the forehead. I'm not planning to go anywhere. At that moment, Richard stepped into the room. He looked at the scene before him, his daughters resting peacefully in the arms of the woman he had once dismissed as just the help. Miss Natasha, he began, his voice still hoarse, if you're willing, I'd like to officially offer you the position of director for the Child Trauma Recovery Program our family foundation is building. Natasha's eyes widened in surprise. It's a project my late wife Amanda dreamed of, but after she passed, I didn't have the strength to continue, until today. He paused, then spoke again more firmly. You're the most qualified person to lead it, and if you accept, I believe Amanda would be incredibly proud. Natasha looked at him for a long moment. Finally, she nodded. I'll do it, for the girls, for Amanda, and for every child who's ever been hurt with no one to stand up for them. Richard smiled for the first time in weeks. That night, as rain poured down the Whitmore mansion, once heavy with prejudice and division, felt lighter than it had in years. Because truth, even when painful, is the only way to begin again from a place of honesty and healing. 1 week later, the first light of dawn streamed through the large windows of the Whitmore family room. But this time, it didn't illuminate a cold, closed-off house. It shone on a home slowly opening up, learning to mend wounds it never acknowledged before. Ruby and Rose sat at the breakfast table, scribbling in their coloring books. Each girl beamed, their eyes glowing with a peace rarely seen before. In the kitchen corner, Richard was awkwardly preparing breakfast himself, something he hadn't done since Amanda passed. His hands were clumsy, but his eyes showed determination. Natasha stood nearby, assisting gently, never scolding or correcting, just observing with a calm smile. That one's burning, she said softly, pointing to the pan where smoke curled from the edge of a pancake. Richard chuckled. First time. I think running a corporation might be easier than mastering this pan. Natasha nodded, half joking. Sometimes kids don't need perfect pancakes, they just need to know someone's trying for them. He looked at her, visibly moved. In Richard's eyes, it was no longer mere admiration, it was trust. Trust in a woman who had dared to walk into his world quietly but unshakably and change everything from the ground up. That afternoon, Richard called a meeting with the Whitmore Corporation Board of Directors, something he hadn't done since Amanda passed away. The boardroom on the 33rd floor had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago skyline. One by one, the executives, mostly white men in tailored suits, filed in, unaware of what was about to unfold. Richard stepped up to the podium. Standing beside him was Natasha, formally introduced for the first time in any high-level corporate meeting. I want to announce a transformative change, Richard began. Starting today, Natasha Williams will serve as the executive director of our new initiative. Hope reimagined a mental health and recovery program for orphaned children with special focus on underserved Black communities. Murmurs spread across the room. She is a leading expert in this field, Richard continued, and more importantly, she brings a depth of insight into the struggles we've long ignored. It's time we lead not just in finance, but in compassion. One board member raised his hand. Are you sure this is the right choice? Her background doesn't exactly match what we've seen in previous directors. Precisely why she's the most qualified, Richard cut in firm. I misjudged her once. I won't make that mistake again. Natasha stepped forward. Her gaze was steady without arrogance. I'm not here asking for pity, she said. I'm here to work with field experience, a heart that has lived through the very pain we're trying to heal, and with one goal, real change for voiceless children. A long silence followed. Then slowly, one by one, heads began to nod. The meeting adjourned in a heavy but hopeful atmosphere. Richard turned to Natasha. I think Amanda's smiling down on us tonight. That evening, when Natasha returned to her modest apartment in the South Side, Marcus, her younger brother, was waiting at the door. He smiled as she walked in. You did it. Natasha hugged him tightly. Not just for me, for you, for your wife, for kids like Ruby and Rose. She handed him a folder. Richard wants to talk with you. He admits firing you was a mistake, and he's offering you the role of head of community development. Marcus looked at her, overwhelmed. You fought for me. No, Natasha interrupted gently. I fought for the truth. 1 month later, the launch ceremony for Hope Reimagined was held at the downtown Civic Center. Hundreds attended, from city officials and media to families who had suffered loss. On the big screen, short films played of children in therapy, smiles slowly returning to once empty faces. Natasha stepped onto the stage. Behind her stood Richard Marcus and little Ruby and Rose. "When I was a child growing up in the South Side," she began, "I didn't think anyone would ever hear my voice. I watched my brother be turned away because of his skin color. I saw kids lose their mothers and be left unseen." She paused, eyes scanning the crowd. "But today we're here to begin again. To tell every child out there, you are not invisible, you deserve healing, and you are not alone." The entire audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation. Natasha bowed her head. In her chest was something indescribable, a sense of ending and a new beginning all at once. That night, after the launch of Hope Reimagined, Natasha sat quietly in her new office on the 5th floor of the Whitmore Foundation building. The room wasn't flashy or grand, but it was warm, lined with framed drawings made by children in the program. She gazed out the window. The city lights twinkled like tiny fragments of hope, finally finding their place. A soft knock on the door. It was Richard. "Are you busy?" he asked, gently. "Not at all," Natasha smiled, motioning for him to come in. Richard approached, holding a small wooden box covered in the dust of time. He looked at her, overcome with emotion. In Richard's eyes now, it wasn't just admiration, it was trust. Trust in a woman who had dared to step into his world quietly, steadfastly, and changed everything from the inside out. That afternoon, Richard called a meeting with the Whitmore Corporation Board of Directors, a move he hadn't made since Amanda's death. The boardroom on the 33rd floor, with its glass walls overlooking the Chicago skyline, slowly filled with executives, mostly white men in tailored suits, unaware of what was about to unfold. Richard took the podium. At his side stood Natasha, for the first time being introduced in an official capacity at a high-level meeting. "I want to announce a pivotal change," Richard began. "Starting today, Natasha Williams will serve as executive director of the company's new initiative, Hope Reimagined, a psychological healing and recovery program for orphaned children with a focus on communities of color." Murmurs filled the room. "She's a leading expert in the field," Richard continued, "and more importantly, she has insight into the issues we've long overlooked. I believe the time has come for us to lead not only in finance, but in humanity." A board member raised his hand. "Are you certain this is the right fit? Her background isn't exactly conventional for someone in this role." "That's exactly why she's more qualified than anyone else," Richard interrupted firmly. "I misjudged her once. I won't make that mistake again." Natasha stepped forward. Her gaze was steady, not proud, but resolute. "I'm not here to ask for pity," she said. "I'm here to work, with field experience, with the heart of someone who's lived it, and with one goal only: to make real change for children who've never had a voice." A long silence followed, then slowly, one by one, the board members nodded. The meeting ended in a heavy but hopeful stillness. Richard turned to Natasha. "I think Amanda is smiling down on us right now." That evening, Natasha returned to her small apartment on the South Side. Marcus, her younger brother, was already waiting at the door. He smiled as she walked in. "You did it." Natasha hugged him tightly. "Not just for me, for you, for your wife, for kids like Ruby and Rose." She handed him a folder. "Richard wants to speak with you again. He admits firing you was a mistake, and he wants you back. This time as Director of Community Development." Marcus looked at her, deeply moved. "You fought for me." "No," Natasha cut him off gently. "I fought for the truth." A month later, the Hope Reimagined launch event was held at the downtown convention center. Hundreds attended, from city officials and media representatives to families who had experienced loss. On a massive screen, videos played of children undergoing therapy, tiny smiles returning to faces once frozen in trauma. Natasha stepped onto the stage. Behind her stood Richard Marcus and little Ruby and Rose. "When I was a little girl growing up on the South Side," she began, "I never thought my voice would matter. I watched my brother be turned away because of the color of his skin. I saw children who had lost their mothers and no one cared." She paused, scanning the room. "But today we're here to begin again. To tell those children, you are not invisible. You deserve healing, and you are not alone." The entire room rose in a standing ovation. Natasha bowed her head. Inside, she felt something indescribable, a sense of closure and a beginning all at once. Later that evening, Natasha sat quietly in her new office on the fifth floor of the Whitmore Foundation building. It wasn't extravagant or flashy, just warm, decorated with framed drawings by children in the program. She gazed out the window. The city lights shimmered like scattered pieces of hope slowly coming together. The door creaked open. It was Richard. "Am I interrupting?" he asked softly. "Not at all," Natasha smiled, gesturing him in. Richard stepped closer, holding a small wooden box worn by time. "I think it's time I gave you this." Natasha frowned slightly at the box. Inside were a bundle of old handwritten letters, the script soft and precise. She recognized it immediately, her mother's handwriting. "After your mother passed," Richard said, his voice hoarse, "she sent these to me through her lawyer. But I never had the courage to read them." He stepped back, leaving Natasha alone with the past. Each letter, each line was a window into the life of a mother she never got to meet. Her love for Richard, her pregnancy and solitude, her decision not to destroy his family's happiness, and her final wish. "If my daughter can be loved just a fraction as much as you love your own, then I will be at peace." Tears rolled silently down Natasha's cheeks. She gently set the last letter aside and took a deep breath. The next morning, Natasha took Ruby and Rose to school as usual, but this time there was someone else walking with them, Richard. The girls clung to his hands, unwilling to let go. Teachers and parents passing by stole glances, surprised to see the founder of one of America's largest corporations carrying a young black girl in his arms, beaming like a proud grandfather. "Can you tell me what you're learning today?" Richard asked, crouching to meet Rose's eyes. "Yes, we're learning about families," teacher said. "Family is anyone who loves and protects you. Blood doesn't matter." Richard froze for a moment. Then he smiled softly. "She's absolutely right." That night, Natasha visited her mother's grave for the first time in many years. The place was quiet, shaded by trees. The only sound was the breeze rustling through the grass. She placed a bouquet of white flowers down and sat beside the headstone engraved with Lena Williams. "Mom," Natasha whispered, "I read your letters. I know how much you suffered, but I want you to know I'm okay, and Marcus is okay too." She paused as if listening. "I forgave him, Mom, and I think you should too, because in the end, I believe he finally understands." Months later, the Whitmore Foundation opened the Third Hope Reimagined Center, this one in Detroit. Natasha, now affectionately called the woman who heals little hearts, by the media, spoke with calm power before hundreds of guests. Marcus, now leading the community outreach program in Chicago, was helping hundreds of families overcome violence, racial injustice, and poverty. Richard, though semi-retired, remained active in the foundation's charity work. He often visited the centers with Ruby and Rose playing piano, reading stories to children who had never once been called special. As for Jessica, she never returned. Rumor had it she was living in seclusion in the South, writing her memoir. But that no longer mattered, because the Whitmore family had changed, not just a symbol of wealth and influence, but a living testament to something once thought impossible: healing, transformation, and love that defies prejudice. One spring afternoon in the small garden behind the mansion, Natasha played piano with Ruby and Rose. The soft notes filled the air. It was Amanda's favorite piece, now reimagined by Natasha herself. Richard sat nearby, silently watching the three women he loved most. A family unlike any other, but somehow exactly what he had always needed. "Can I call her Mom?" Ruby whispered in his ear. Richard looked at Natasha. She turned her eyes full of emotion. He nodded. "If that's what you want." "And if she says yes," Ruby ran and threw her arms around Natasha. "Mommy, Natasha." Natasha pulled her in, eyes glistening with tears. For the first time in her life, she felt whole, not because of recognition, not because of success, but because she was truly loved. And so the black woman who had been cast aside for 16 long years returned, not for revenge but to heal. From a penniless single mother, she became the heart of a quiet revolution rooted in compassion. And in the end, the truth came to light, not to wound, but to begin again, stronger, braver, and more beautiful than ever before.